Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Fear and Greed is working with the team at trading platform moomoo on a series for investors. Every Friday, we're bringing you an episode exploring how to use technology and data for smarter investing. Today, we're going deeper into investing strategy, and it all comes back to research. In particular, how to navigate an industry's value chain, including its upstream, midstream, and downstream companies in order to find the right opportunities. Remember, the information in this episode is general in nature and doesn't take into account your own circumstances. Michael McCarthy is the Chief Commercial Officer and Market Strategist at trading platform moomoo, which is a great supporter of this podcast. Now a regular guest. Michael, welcome back.
Thanks very much, Sean. I have to get my regular dose of Fear and Greed podcast.
Fantastic. When we talk about an industry's value chain, I'm sure many of us broadly understand what we're talking about. But can you perhaps explain what it is?
Well, I'd like to give an example of how important understanding industry chains can be. Now, many people will be familiar with the work of Michael Lewis. He wrote Moneyball, which became a great movie. He also wrote The Big Short and a number of other great books and articles about markets. But his first ever book was called Liar's Poker, and it was one of the first books on markets I ever read. Now, there are some real people involved, the former chairman of Solomon's, the former chairman of Lehman's, but there's also some characters that he made up to give people anonymous talking points in the book. And in one of them, he describes a character he calls Dash Riprock. And Dash is a trader. And Dash explained his view on the markets globally. He said they're all interconnected like a spider's web. And when you pluck on one strand of the web, the vibrations go throughout the markets, throughout the world. And he gave the example in the book of what happened when there was a nuclear explosion at a place nobody had ever heard of at that time called Chernobyl in Russia, of course. Now, the immediate market reaction was to buy wheat. It was known that Chernobyl was not far from Ukraine, the Belarus, key food-producing areas. But Dash Riprock went one step better, and he realised that wheat's a storable commodity, but things like fresh fruit are not. And so he bought apples, and he made a small fortune out of anticipating where the ripples on that web would turn up in the market, and buying apples was a much better trade than the very crowded buying wheat trade. And it's the same idea with the industry chain. When something happens with a company or in an industry, sometimes the best play is not the immediate one. It's not necessarily buying Tesla, but perhaps looking down the chain to buy into lithium producers or to buy into car and parts resellers and retailers. So understanding the industry chain gives investors and traders more options, more ability to pick the key sweet spots in an industry that might be most affected by an event.
Okay, so I remember reading about data centers in the last couple of weeks, and someone was investing in air conditioning companies whose main clients were data center builders, because they figure the more data centers, the better the air conditioning supply will do. So it's that kind of thing. Tell me, how do the industry chain tools on the moomoo platform work then, with that as background?
Well, there's a whole component area of the app that has the industry chains in it, and there are dozens of them. And they're built around different ideas. So some are built around companies. I mentioned Tesla. There's another one built around NVIDIA, another popular trading stock. And people wanted to know who the downstream retailers and users of their chips were and who was supplying them with their raw goods. And those who were able to look up and down the industry chain possibly spotted better opportunities than getting into an already frothier NVIDIA price. So we've got dozens of chains, as I mentioned. They do everything. Obviously, tech is a bit of a focus. So there's a chat GPT chain, an electric vehicles chain, semiconductors chains, all the ones you would expect. But you might not expect to see a drone or cloud computing chain. You might not expect to see a gold chain or coal chain. There's travel and transportation, cancer drugs, all of these different industry chains. And they all are backed up by the companies that are involved in those different parts of the chain, whether they're upstream, whether they're midstream, or whether they're downstream parts of the industry chain. They're all there. And when you click through the chain, you can click through and see which companies do what in that industry chain. So you very quickly get an idea of who's interconnected and how an event might ripple up and down an industry chain, and make it much easier to select the better way to get exposure to that idea or theme.
Yeah, so the better way, so it's kind of a more holistic approach to a theme like AI. What about I mean, what other benefits does it have as opposed to throwing all your money at Nvidia, which at the moment is, well, as of a couple of days ago, was actually the largest company in the world just for a few hours. I mean, what's the advantage of not just putting in Nvidia, but thinking broader than that?
Well, we know that one of the most powerful tools that every investor can use to spread their risk is diversification. And diversifying up and down a chain can allow investors to take exposure, particularly if they're longer term holders, to a good idea or an industry they believe has superior growth without it all being concentrated in one company. If you're in one stock and the company secretary runs off with the company funds, it doesn't matter how good the industry they're in is, that company's share price is very likely to plummet. So by spreading through an industry, we remove a lot of the company-specific risk that can come with the exposures to a single large player in an industry chain.
Stay with me, Michael. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Michael McCarthy from moomoo. Okay, we talk about upstream, downstream. Is one better than the other when you're using these tools, or is it just what you prefer, or how's that work?
Yeah, I try to be agnostic about things like this, Sean. The reality is that it can happen anywhere in a chain. It depends very much on the event that's possibly driving the analysis or the theme that an investor's trying to explore as to whether or not they want to go upstream or downstream. It depends on the industry as well, of course. Some people, for example, prefer not to be in commodity markets. They don't want to suffer the vagaries. So even though they might have a view on car manufacturing, the amount of steel and copper required, they prefer not to be in the miners that are digging it out of the ground. They might look at a step in between in the chain, the refiners who produce the shells that the car manufacturer might use. So it depends very much on the personal views and experiences of the investor. As a long-time trader and investor myself, I will go wherever the opportunities present themselves, but people have their own views as to whether it's better to be upstream, downstream, or midstream.
Are we talking about specific investors, or is this for everyone? Moomoo's platform, being able to use these tools, is it for everyone?
Well, this importantly puts key information in front of investors who might even just be starting out and might help them formulate ideas. But the more sophisticated the investor or trader using the industry chain tool, the more sophisticated the trading that comes from it. And so understanding where chains interconnect, for example, can be a next order level of understanding of those industries for those who've studied it. So it's certainly available to those who are new to trading and want to understand industries better. And it's new, of course, for new investors who want to understand where the company they're thinking of investing in sits in its industry, but it's a very powerful tool for more sophisticated traders and investors. And the thing about it is they're pre-built so that when an event occurs, you can go straight to that industry chain, get an idea of where you want to be while perhaps other people are still digesting the news.
Yeah, are there particular industries where these work best, or is it across the board?
Well, it's very event driven. Some of our investors do use them to identify thematics. They have a long-term theme they want to gain exposure to. But where we often see a spike in usage of the industry change is when there's an industry-specific event. So, if there is a tariff introduced on coal in one of the major buying countries, or if there's a natural disaster that affects the supply of a good, let's hope not. But if it does happen, traders who are on the ball can go straight to the industry chain and understand what the impacts of that might be up and down the chain and across national borders.
Yeah, okay, so that's the point. It's not just Australian or Wall Street here. These chains can go very broad, presumably, at least in a geographic sense.
Absolutely. At the moment, we've got a focus on the Hong Kong and US stocks that are interconnected. Clearly, the trade between China and the US is one of the most important trade relationships in the globe. And so understanding the companies on either side of that can be a very powerful tool. Over time, we will be rolling that out to include as many markets as we can.
It's interesting. This is our fourth in a series with moomoo, and it is amazing the power of technology, or AI, or whatever you want to call it, to actually create these new strategies. Because what you're talking about, having that at your fingertips, is much easier than a few years ago, having to find a Bloomberg screen or a Reuters screen and do all the research yourself.
Well, Sean, I hate to admit it, but when I first came into the market, part of my job was to take a ruler and 3 coloured pens every day and go to the drawing room on the side of the dealing room and add to the daily charts of the 7 major currencies that we traded. We did it by hand. Yeah. Markets have come a long way and so has the technology, but they're just tools, Sean. Yeah. That's the idea. They're there for investors and traders to use to better enhance their activities in the market and to give them a better chance of successfully realising their goals. They're tools. And we can get a bit carried away with how powerful they are. The reality is they serve investors and traders. That's what they're for.
Michael, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you.
That was Michael McCarthy from moomoo, a great supporter of this podcast. For more information on the moomoo platform, follow the link in today's show notes. And remember that information in this podcast is general in nature and you should seek professional advice and make sure a product is right for you before proceeding. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.